recently visited my mother-in-law's house to help her with some carpet installation, and we moved a dresser. And to move the dresser, I took a drawer out of the bottom of the dresser, and in there I found a very interesting old document. And I decided, well, I'm going to do something with that. Let me show you the document. You might say it's got a few problems. This is actually from Carol's, my wife's great-grandfather, and it's from his service in World War I. And this was a certificate given to him in French, by the French, when he fought in France in the First World War. And I saw it, and I saw a wonderful piece, because my grandfather fought in the First World War in France as well, and he actually got the French Medal of Honor, and I've got the certificate and framed that my mom has had ever since she got it. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try to do a little restoration work. I've done some Photoshop restoration, nothing ever close to this ambitious, but you can see that the document is completely crumbled away, and there's just pieces. There's small pieces the size of a postage stamp. This is the largest piece here, and you can see in French that it's for Herman Carter, I think is how he pronounced his name. And so I'm going to take some time in Photoshop. I don't know if this is going to work or not. And restore it. I'm going to document along the way how I do the restoration. I'm a certified Photoshop expert, but believe me, there's so many tips and tricks in Photoshop that somebody's going to watch this and go, doesn't he know that he can click that button, or he can pull and drag that, or he can do this or that, and it'd make it so much faster and easier. I'm just going to do it the way I always do it, and that's with the limited knowledge I've got of Photoshop, and I've done some restoration work. And some pretty fun stuff, but nothing ever this challenging. So I don't know if this is going to come out or not, but let's get started. I've decided I'm going to scan each individual piece so that I could place that piece on a canvas, so to speak, and then piece those together by moving them in and out and creating some transitions between them, especially when there's some tears. So my first step is going to be lay this out on a piece of black paper so that I can at least get an idea of where the piece falls on the final document. And then I'm going to scan each individual piece until I get them all captured, and then I'll bring them each into Photoshop, drop them down on the canvas, move them around and put them in place, and then try to clean up the edges. So let's get started. Trying to arrange them on the table in some kind of an order in which they make sense. At first I don't really know what pieces go where, so I'm having to juggle quite a few that don't seem to match up. But I finally figured out where the top was and where the bottom was, and am in the process of finding all the little pieces as well as the big pieces. The signature I found out subsequent to my initial introduction is this is actually Herman Carter. They misspelled his name Herman on the document, and in fact he was killed in action, and this is a recognition of his service. He was actually shot in a tree after the war had just been declared over and the armistice had been signed. So he was shot just after the war was over, and it was posthumously awarded to him. So I've got them all sort of in order, and I'll now take you to my comments after I realigned them. So now you can see that I have the pieces aligned, and the document shows Herman Carter. His name actually was Herman Carter. I've done a little bit more research, and this is actually my wife's great uncle, her grandfather's brother, and also found out that he was killed on November the 6th in 1918. The war was declared over on November 11th, so it was just before the war was over. But from the story I've read online, he was actually helping to save someone at the time and did not know that the armistice had been declared or was going to be signed, and neither did the enemy. And so as a result, he was killed just days before the war was over, and his death was a devastating blow to the family. As you can imagine, he was only 20 years old when he was killed, and had fought through the war. Started as a private, and he wound up as a corporal, Company D, 60th Infantry. So it's quite a meaningful thing to be able to restore this piece. Well, after several nights of work and probably 15 or so hours of manipulation, I was successful in putting together this document, and this was the original pile of scraps that we had to work with, and I've put them in a box where they're going to be safe until I get around to figuring out how to piece them back together using the proper restoration methods. I was able to put it back together electronically and then print out quite a faithful representation of the document, quite detailed, and I'm going to be able to mount this and then put it under a frame with a mat, and be able to give it to my mother-in-law and be able to hang it proudly on the wall at her house. So very happy with the results. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy learning a little bit about how I did it as you go through the process. It's about an hour-long video, and it does go into some detail about how these pieces were shifted together and melded together and made into one piece, and then everything was unified in color corrected. So thanks for watching. The document here, the first step that I'm taking is to scan each of the individual pieces in to the computer and putting them on a canvas. The canvas I started out with a 13 by 19 canvas, and as I started to lay the pieces out on the canvas, I realized I needed to create a larger canvas in order to move the pieces around, and so I changed the canvas size to about 13 by 20, and I'll show you how I did that in just a moment. You can see the pieces are currently being scanned in off of my flatbed scanner. I'm using a scanning resolution of 600 dpi, and the document that I created was also 600 dpi, so they matched up with the document that they were being laid out on. And I'm using the image capture program on the Mac, which allows you to capture the image and then bring it into Photoshop. So you can see here I'm creating a document, and I'm starting out with a 14-inch by 19-inch document. Actually, I think I said 13 by 19, which is the size of the paper, 600 dpi, and that's the size of the canvas. I'm then going to take, and I'm going to go to File and then Place Embedded, and the documents were all scanned to my desktop, and they were numbered scan 1, scan 2, scan 3, and so forth, all the way up to scan number 19. Some of the pieces were larger than my scanner. I do have a large flatbed scanner, but the Epson that I use is a little more high resolution than the HP the large flatbed scanner. So I scanned in each piece at the 600 dpi resolution, and some places the scanner itself would separate each image and create more than one image as it was scanned. So I have multiple TIFFs, even though I only scanned, for example, 5 or 6 pieces on the same scan. I was able to take each scan, and the flatbed scanner actually separated out the pieces, so each piece had its own file name. So I'm bringing in, as you can see, using file, place embedded, and putting each piece down on the canvas in no particular order. You'll see on the right hand side, lower right hand side, each scan comes in as a separate layer, and that layer allows me to manipulate the layers, and you'll see that after I get all the pieces in here that I don't have enough room, and so I went into the here we go, canvas size, and I'm changing the canvas size. So it's making a large canvas. I think it turned out to be a 20-inch by 20-inch canvas, and this allows me to move the pieces around on the canvas. I also have auto select on the layers. If you go to the upper left hand corner, you'll see auto select as a checkbox. What that means is when you put your cursor over an item, if you have auto select, then it'll automatically pick that layer and you can move it around. You'll also see what I'm doing here is I'm hitting the Command T key, which is transform, and when I hit the transform key, I'm able to resize it, rotate it, and do a number of other things. But in this case, I don't want to resize anything. I want it all to be the same size because they all scanned in at the same size. But I do need to rotate the pieces because some of them scanned in vertically. So the Command T allows me to rotate the scan piece, and as I hold the Shift key down, when I rotate, it gives me a 90-degree or a 180-degree rotation. Now here you'll see what I'm doing is I'm taking the pieces that I had to do 2 scans on, and I'm matching them up by creating a transparency of 1. The transparency I create on 1 will then allow me to see how it lines up with the piece below it. And as I mentioned, the ability to take a look at the item below allows the scan to be able to be manipulated. And I use the arrow key once I've selected the piece, and you'll see me transform to change the angle of rotation. It's just slightly to be able to line up the pieces on top of each other. I got a little confused as I was doing this, and eventually what I did was I turned off all of the layers that didn't pertain to the one I was working on. This initial point that I'm at in the rebuilding of this is such that the main thing I was trying to do was get the pieces rotated and put into roughly the position that they needed to be. I just added a hue saturation layer to the overall piece by going to the add a layer, an adjustment layer, which allowed all the pieces to have the same hue and tint. And you'll see here I'm simply trying to get the pieces roughly in place that I need to have to work on. So you'll see here I've lined up 2 pieces as closely as I can, and I've created a layer mask on one in order to, and I've blanked out all the other layers around it. And by using the layer mask and having lined these pieces up very carefully against each other, I'm able to use a layer mask and to clean up the edges between the 2 pieces that were juxtaposed on top of each other. When you use a layer mask, you can see me going back and forth between the two layers, but the layer mask allows the top layer to be able to be matched up and cleaned up, and by using a brush with either black or white, I can transfer between masking or unmasking the two layers. Once I get the two layers cleaned up as much as I can at this point, I'm not worried about the final cleanup, but just as long as I've got them lined up in such a way that they're cleaned up enough to get as much of the artifacts out of the way, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the two layers and make sure that they're all, you can see me going back and forth between the two layers, making sure they're as lined up and clean as possible before I merge the layers. And here you can see me moving the layers around. And one time I grouped the layers in order to keep them straight, but the grouping to me became confusing because the layers became hidden within the group. So you'll see me, I'm continuing to clean up the edges between the two layers, and once I get the layers together, I'm going to hold the control key down and hit merge layers, and you just saw those two layers merged. Now those are one layer with the two pieces together. So I've now created one of the sections near the bottom of the document. The rest of the pieces are still in there. They are, you can see me also manipulating the hue saturation. I used a saturation of about 15 and a hue of about 41, which is a really good sepia tone. And then I hit the colorize button on the adjustment layer to give me the same basic color as the original document. I've now found and located the layer that has the half of the bottom piece, and I'm now moving it in place. I'm going to take the top piece after I get them in place, and I'm going to clean up the two edges by using a layer mask. And the layer mask allows me to clean the edges off of one scan, and as long as the two pieces are lined up, then it's going to clean up the scan from the other piece and give me a nice clean edge. Now a lot of folks would look at this and say you should have done a selection and all the rest of it. I prefer myself to just use a layer mask and then clean the two edges up with the layer mask and paint out the overlay of the scan until I get it close. I can go back and forth using the X key. The X key will switch between black and white. The white would reveal, the X would erase the mask, and you can see on the left that the X and the X is transferring between the white and the black, and my brush tool is, you'll see also that I'm using the arrow key to move the top layer to clean it up where it's lined up as carefully as possible. Still not perfect, but it's getting there. So now I've created another layer. I'm going to merge those two layers, and those two layers now become a single layer. And that's the basic process I'm going to use throughout the document to clean up and put the layers back together. I found also that the 1918, and I'll get to that later, this is where the little piece of France was its own little piece. So I had to take France and use transform to be able to get the angle just right, and then zoom in on it, move it into place, and then clean up the edges. And I'll get real close on this to be able to show you the way I was able to clean up France and reposition it into a place you can see where the scan is, it's a square, and therefore there's a lot of white, and I didn't want the white, so I had to paint out the white on the scan. You can see also that it's partially transparent, so I can see underneath the France piece, and the white there you'll see, and I'm moving it with my arrow key, using the up arrow, the side, left side, right side arrow until I get the letters lined up to the point where I need them to be. Now I'm painting out on the layer mask, I'm painting out the white of the scan, which allows the France to show through, and then I'm going to take the opacity and raise it back up to 100% so that I can then clean up the two sides of the piece and clean out all the white from the scan until it's perfect. Once it's perfect, I can then take the two layers. You'll see me making sure I got the right layer, and merge the two layers into one layer. So I now have a nice clean piece that has the France on it. Now here I tried to create a group from the two layers, which I did, and it became confusing. Later on I'll ungroup those two pieces together. But when you group them together, they'll act as one piece, so I can slide them around and put them in place as if they're one piece. It turned out that really wasn't that helpful, so I wound up merging the layers instead of grouping them, because once they're merged, they're one piece. And ultimately what I would do is use this as one single layer that I could then manipulate. So I'm going to fast forward and kind of show you that's the basic process I went through, was to take each piece and find its corresponding neighbor, use transparency on the one layer to be able to see how to line up it with the underlying layer. And once I got those two layers lined up, use transform to be able to slide them into place. And once they're in place, clean up the edges, and you'll see me now pulling them as much as I could together to see what's still missing. And I found that I had quite a few gaps in there, which were hidden underneath the overall document. So I had to uncheck the layers to be able to see what I had and find the pieces that were missing. This is an interesting piece right here, because the two layers, this was a big part of the whole process. These two layers were very difficult to line up and clean up, but I was able to do it, creating a transparency off the top layer, which I'd created earlier, which you saw, and then using my transformer key to get the angles right. And then once they were lined up, using my arrow key to make minor adjustments and changes. I also dragged down a guide bar, which if you grab in Photoshop, if you grab the ruler and pull down on it, you'll bring down a guide bar, and the guide bar was perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical, and that guide bar gave me the ability to make sure my pieces lined up vertically and horizontally all across the piece, and that was extremely helpful. So here I'm getting the pieces pretty well lined up. You can see the President of the Republic's signatures going to be one of the keys, so I've now just matched it up pretty well. There's my guide bar, and when I pull the guide bar down, I can see if my piece is vertically aligned properly. Now I can see that the scan on the top piece has there's my bottom piece and my top piece and the scans. So what I can do now, once the scans are lined up, or once the two layers are lined up, I can then come in and I can use a layer mask, and I can paint out the white from the top layer, and that'll allow the bottom layer to match up and show up just right. So here I'm going to come back, and using my paintbrush, I'm going to paint out the top layers using the black on the layer mask. I'm able to paint out the white, and then I'll switch back over to white and clean up anything that I might have hit by accident with the black, and get myself a clean scan. And you can see I'm going back and forth with the white and the black. If you don't know what I'm talking about on layer masks, then you'll have to go look it up. But layer masks are the key to any kind of photo restoration, photo touching, retouching. Layer mask and adjustment layers both are key. And if you don't understand those, go to YouTube and do a tutorial on layer masks and adjustment layers for Photoshop. And that's what allows these two layers to be able to come up against each other and be juxtaposed and cleaned up in such a fashion as this. And so this is the basic rough foundation of putting these pieces together. So what I'm going to do is move forward to the cleanup phase. I'm going to go to one place where I have to recreate the 1918, and then this is the same process I'll use through the whole piece to be able to put the piece together. So I'm going to fast forward here and show you the rest of the piece as it goes together. So here's the process I took for the next few minutes. I'm going to fast forward through all the sections that I pieced together and give you a little insight into what some of the situations were and how I had to get this together. A lot of this was using transparencies, where I could manipulate between two different layers until I got them lined up and cleaned up, and then I would merge those two layers. As you can see here, I'm putting a couple of layers together using my arrow keys to move the layers back and forth, making sure they're lined up. And then once they're lined up, using the layer mask to be able to clean the edge off and make the edge of one match up to the edge of the other. The scan includes white from the scanner, and I of course don't need that. In this case, I have a section of this last scan which I needed to rescan and then add to the right hand side the piece that was missing and line it up. I used my guides, which I pulled off the rulers, to make sure the verticals were accurate, which was really helpful to be able to do that. As you can see, I had to clean up the edge between the two layers, and then there's my guide. I pulled a guide over from the ruler, and you can see the blue line, which is the guide, which was really helpful. And then I would take the next layer, next piece, line it up, move it, put it on the guide, move it down with my arrows, and then once I got it in place, I would use a transparency to make sure it was right, and then I would clean up the edge to make sure that it was right. You can see the other pieces pulling together. In this case, I had one scan that had 3 pieces on it, so I was able to pull out the pieces off that single scan and then clean off the original scan by editing the contents of the scan, removing those 2 pieces that were part of the piece. Then I as you can see here, the piece had to fit on there somehow. Had to figure out how it fit on there. It looked like it was going one way. Then I said, nope, it's going to actually have to be reversed, and you'll see me transform it and rotate it around until it was matched up properly. And this whole process through here was just a matter of taking the pieces and putting them in the right place, cleaning the edges of the scan up using the layer mask, and then allowing them to be able to fit together. Of course, this process is actually sped up about 9 times, so what you see here is actually quite a fast process. It looks like here, but this took several hours of work to make sure that everything lined up just right and cleaned up just right. And then, of course, I discovered that the war was over in 1918, and the 1918 was missing off the original document here, and so I was able to work on the 1918, and you'll see that a little bit later. So I'm going to continue to put the piece together, clean off the edges, clean off the scan marks, use my blue ruler guides to make sure that they line up against the ruler. You can see here there's a piece on the edge that has to be placed, and cleaned up, and using the arrow keys I was able to move the pieces around and put them in the proper place, and then clean up the edges between them. And when I get done with this section, then as you can see here, there's the date section here has to be put in place, and it's missing quite a bit of the information, which was somewhat distressing, you might say, but I was able to pull the date, the remnant of the date in. I had to expand the canvas there. You just saw the canvas. I added some more real estate to the canvas to be able to work on the piece, give it some room, similar to what you would do if you had a drawing board and you were trying to put pieces together. This piece here on the corner had to be placed, and I discovered in working on this that there were pieces and there was detail missing on the left-hand side that was available on the right-hand side. And you'll see here I'm straightening up the left-hand side and finding the pieces that go into the date and trying to make sure that everything lines up and matches up the way it's supposed to. Pulling in the right side, and as I was working on this, there were certain parts of the right side that were working, and some parts of the left side that weren't working. One thing I kind of sped right by is I added a layer that had the dark brown, because the white was quite distracting. So I created a layer on the very base of the Photoshop drawing that was the dark brown, and that gave me a little bit better view of how it should look. And the dark brown background instead of the bright white gave me a glimpse into what areas needed to be fixed. Now here you see me cleaning up the edge somewhat, just using a simple clone stamp. I would clone from one spot to the next. Here I'm using the Content Aware fill tool, and by using this you can define an area, drag it over another area, and the Photoshop will actually analyze where you started and where you went, and then create content based on the texture and all the rest of it. Here I'm using a healing brush, and I honest to goodness don't know how Photoshop knows how to do this, but in a lot of cases the Photoshop healing brush will analyze the content, and just by brushing over it, it'll fix it. In this case here, I used a rubber stamp and picked up content in a lot of places where the texture or the little lines, there I used the 0 or the O and used the stamp tool to be able to pull an O from one place and put it down on another place where it was missing. And a lot of this cleanup here is done with a rubber stamp tool, where I'm using a source from somewhere else in the document that was similar, and it really helped to be able to do that. Sped up the process quite a bit. So between the clone stamp and that right there is the healing brush. The healing brush, somehow Photoshop is able to interpret the movement or the content of what you are healing, you might say, and it somehow figures out what you want. Honest to goodness, don't know how it does that. But it does speed up the process of photo restoration. Here I'm just basically using the clone stamp. I believe this is the clone stamp. It may be the healing brush. And by simply drawing over the piece with the healing brush, it looks at it and says, okay, it looks like that line is not supposed to be there. Here I'm going to use a rubber stamp tool, or maybe the content aware, to be able to clean up that little patch right there. So there's a lot of rather meticulous work, but it's going in as close as you can get, taking a look at it, finding areas that are broken, simply patching them up, cleaning them up, and it does a terrific job of trying to eliminate any kind of anomalies that are in the piece. There, once in a while it'll analyze it improperly, and you can just go back and undo it. Hit Control Z to undo. So I'm just going piece by piece, just through all the places where things were patched, and cleaning up any areas where the scan marks were left, any areas where it doesn't quite look. I want it to still look like an antique document, so I'm not trying to get rid of every little imperfection on the sheet, but anything that looks like it would be distracting in the final print, I'm going to try to clean it up. And this right here, you'll see there's an inconsistency in this corner, and I'll show you how I fix that in a little while. This is again just not doing a thorough job, but at least getting it to where it looks pretty decent, and for the most part is cleaned up. This background, I made a few changes after this a little bit later. Actually, I think after I did this recording even, I made some changes in the background so that when it printed it looked a little bit more lifelike. Here I had to spend a lot of time cleaning up and making this area. I had to undo some things when I would make a mistake, but it would sometimes pick up a remnant of of a piece, when it's trying to analyze what you're trying to do, it sometimes makes some false assumptions, but generally speaking, when you're using a healing brush or the clone stamp, you're going to make pretty good decisions, and it's going to make good decisions. There's the signature from the President of the Republic in France. I want to make sure he was right. And pick up some of the little... I thought the little tilde over the E was a mistake, but it's actually an accent mark. Thankfully I didn't clean that up. So a lot of this work here is now just meticulously going through. If you see in some areas where its coloration is not quite right. I also figured out that this was a bird, a little eagle, on top of the packs, and somehow got obscured by the damage, and I went in, had to go in and rebuild the eagle. Now here I'm taking some time on the top, which needed some major rework. The top was a challenge, to say the least. There was imperfections in the paper. There was imperfections in the script. There was some areas where I basically had to use a pen tool and just redraw a lot. Here's where I started doing some redrawing using the brush tool. Use both the brush. Here's the picking up the color from the existing lettering, and then using the pen and brush to draw in at a close scale the lettering, reproduce it. Not always 100% as accurate as I'd like to have, but not bad. I would also pick up the color of the paper and then paint the areas where the white was. Some areas I didn't worry too much about it because I think it was a double stamp from the original print, which I didn't need to change. So here I'm taking some time to, I took the E from one place and moved it, recreated it using the stamp tool. Here I'm using the R to build the other R, using the rubber stamp tool, rebuild the R. And I'm going to use the pen tool here to recreate the areas that are messed up with the lettering. So you get a little bit better picture of what's going on. I also spent some time cleaning up the paper. Here I'm using the clone stamp, or the healing brush, and cleaning up some of the discoloration in the paper. I have to do Control Z quite a bit. If it doesn't quite work, I'll undo it with Control Z. Or make that a Command Z. But because it's an older document, you don't really want it to be totally perfectly clean. You want it to have the look and feel of an old document. Here I actually use the rubber stamp tool to pull some of these areas from another part of the drawing and recreate the stars using the existing texture and lines to make it just look exactly the way it would have originally. You can use the space bar as a little hand tool, and the space bar will act as if it'll give you a chance to move the drawing. Here I used a rubber stamp, or I might use a pen tool to redraw these lines that were messed up. It's amazing the detail you can see in the original etching or the original lithograph, or however they printed this originally, which would have been 100 years ago. But the quality of the document was beautiful. I use rubber stamp tool quite a bit to be able to reproduce some of these textures and lines. Even though they weren't 100% accurate, they represented what the original would have, the texture and the look of the original was pretty well reproduced here. As you can see, a lot of attention to detail, because when you print this out in its life size, when it's printed 13 by 19, these little details do show up. They do contribute to the authenticity and the enjoyment, the distraction that some of these markings and problems bring up will take away from the future enjoyment of the piece. So I like to make sure it's as clean as possible. The real trick on this piece came up at the top, which I haven't got to yet. There's also a piece here where you can see that there was a shift in the document, which I was able to correct somewhat, but not totally. And it looked fine, so I didn't worry too much about it when I got done. But I was able to correct some of this using the stamp tool. But here's where it got interesting. Working on this top part became quite a challenge. What I decided to do was to take pieces from the left and move them to the right, and vice versa. There was pieces on the left that would match up to the pieces on the right, and so I was able to select, for example, I'm selecting this leaf right here, creating a new layer with that leaf, and then placing it back down to recreate the leaf that was there, and then I'm taking that and merging that little layer so that it created the leaf. I also, this will come up in a second, but I was able to grab pieces of the right hand side scroll work and create a layer, and then reversed the layer and put it down on the left side so that I was able to begin the process of giving some symmetry to the, and you'll see this come up here. I took the 1914 and I recreated it, moved it over to the right where it was missing the 1918, and then clean up the background around it using the rubber stamp tool. Then the challenge was, how do I create an 8 where the 4 is, which I looked around for an 8, didn't see one. So I went in and grabbed the 9 and then hit Control J to create a second layer. And I said, let me take a look at that 9 and we'll get up close to it. And let me create an 8 out of the 9. So I was able to use the pen tool and the clone stamp. I used to use the rubber stamp to take the top part of the 8 of the 9 and create a bottom part of the 9 with the same curves. And by doing that and then cleaning it up, I came up with a fairly reasonable 8. You'll see that I'll take a pen tool and I'm going to erase, I'm going to draw in the bottom curves of the 8, give them roughly the right shape, and get a sample of the background and then use that to draw in the paper color and eliminate the parts of the 9 that don't look like an 8. And when I got done, I actually had a fairly good looking 8, and you'll see that I'll take that and move the final 8 and take the move tool, which is the V key, move it over to the right place. I'm going to hit Control or Command T to transform it into the right size until it fits just the right size there. When I get it to the right size, I'm going to merge the 2 layers and create a single layer that has the 8. Still needs a little cleanup, so I'm going to go in here and clean up an area around the 8 so that the 1918 looks like 1918 again, which is the year the war ended. You'll also see that on the left side, I think it's coming up. On the left side of the document, the scroll is pretty messed up. Looks pretty bad. And I was able to take the right side of the scroll and I'll finish cleaning up some more on this side. I grabbed this piece and created a little, transformed it, created a little section that made it a little bit more accurate. Then I was able to merge the layers into one and then draw in and clean up the scroll so that it looked probably close to what the original did. And once I did that, I was able to take that and grab that whole piece. If I'm not mistaken, I grabbed that whole piece and I cut and pasted it to the other side and reversed it. And basically what I'm using is, here I'm using a stamp tool to create the darkening and create the proper texture and the proper depth and color as the original. So now I have a fairly nice looking right side. I'm going to save a copy of it at this point. But the left side is still has needs some work. Unless I've already done that part of it. I don't think I have. No, I think I did. I think I already did that part of it. And there I'm working on the background. The background I thought needed a little bit more work. And also when I decided how I was going to print this, I realized that I needed to make sure that the brown was as clean as possible. Because when I mat it, I want to try to mat it with a 13 by 19 piece of mat board. So I'm simply using a clone stamp to be able to clean up the edge of the mat. And also create a little bit of depth, so when it prints it looks like the paper's laying down on the here's where I could have used the selection tool and made it a little bit easier, but I really wanted to have some little organic nature to it, a little bit of imperfection, you might say, as I went around the mat. And this actually printed out almost exactly the way it looks here on that. I've got an Epson 3880 printer, which gives me a nice wide format 13 by 19 print. It'll go up to, I think 17 inches is the widest it'll go. So I'm able to make some nice prints. And it's archival ink, so I don't have to worry about the ink fading over the years. So I'm just cleaning up the outside edge. I'm getting close to the end of the process here. Cleaning up a little bit more here. And my last step is really to go in and just do a once over and a final cleanup, because I don't need it to be much more clean than this for it to really look like a great reproduction of the original. So just scouting through it, seeing if there's anything I need to work on, anything I need to clean up. And it looks like I've pretty much gotten it where I want it, so pretty happy with the result at this point. Still a little bit more work to do, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. So there I've taken 19 little pieces of paper and scanned them all in individually and then put them back down on a canvas and Photoshop. I created a 13 by 19 print, and I've printed it off, and I'll come back and show you how that turned out and how it looks. But so far, pretty happy with it. Oh yeah, I forgot about my little bird. So as I was able to continue to work on this, I realized I had my little bird didn't have a head, so I decided to spend some time and invent a little bird head. And so I created this eagle. I'm assuming it was an eagle, and the eagle I just used a pen tool or a brush tool, very fine, and sketched in my little buddy and created a nice little rendering of a peace eagle. It wasn't what I would call a masterpiece, but anybody that would look closely at this document would go, there's something missing. And so I was able to reproduce the little bird, or at least the version of the little bird that didn't distract from the overall piece. Gave it some, I think that is the word for peace. So I was able to put a little bit of creativity onto the final act of restoring this document.